Hi everybody, I'm Ty Landrum here at Purple Valley Yoga Center in Goa. I'm here with my friend Sam Silversides, and he's going to demonstrate Dandasana and Paschimottanasana, or the staff pose and the intense Western stretch, or what's just more commonly known as forward fold. So I just want to explain a few things to you about hip alignment and the way that you can use engagements in the lower half of the body, which is where the aponic force resides, or the force that governs the exhalation pattern in the body, and the way that you can use those gestures in the legs and in the hips to lift the aponic force up in order to stimulate the pranic force, which is the force that governs inhaling and has an expansive and sort of radiant movement to it. And when these two forces are held in balance in Dandasana, something very interesting starts to happen internally. You feel a sense of vibrance and a flow of sensation that you wouldn't feel otherwise, and it helps to connect you quite readily to this particular mental state that we're interested in cultivating in yoga, which is a state that is both grounded and rooted in the present moment and quite open and receptive at the same time. So a feeling of sort of being stable and yet open and expansive is the state that we're trying to cultivate through postural alignment of the sort that I'm going to explain to you now. Okay, so Dandasana is done from a seated position, and when Sam comes through and sits down, maybe from downward facing dog if he's doing this in the context of the conventional vinyasa, but he comes here to a seated position, and notice that like when he first comes into the position, his pelvis might be tilted back a little bit. And one thing to notice is that when the pelvis is tilted back, the legs will tend to externally rotate. And you can see that happening there at his feet, okay? And this is part of the exhale pattern, which is the pattern that is characterized by a spreading of the back of the body and a little bit of a narrowing in the front, okay? Now, by contrast, the prana pattern is typified by so if the apana pattern is in part typified by a posterior tilt in the pelvis or a backward tilt, the prana pattern, the inhale pattern, is in part typified by a forward tilt, an anterior tilt in the pelvis. And when he has this anterior tilt in the pelvis, the pubic bone is dropping and the coccyx is lifting. And that goes with an internal spiral of the legs, okay? So these two things are important to keep in mind while doing this form, that an external rotation goes with the apana pattern and an internal rotation goes with the prana pattern, okay? So now you can just sit back up. Now, another thing to notice is that if he strongly takes the aponic pattern, an aponic shape, his knees may naturally want to bend, right? Because the aponic pattern is in part typified by a sort of shortening, of the hamstrings and engaging of the hamstrings. And then again, we see this posterior tilt in the pelvis. Whereas if he takes a form that's more expressive of the prana pattern, the legs naturally go quite straight, okay? And so, and we see that with the legs straightening, the quadriceps are engaging more strongly. Whereas when the knees were bent, that could be because the hamstrings are shortening or engaging more strongly, okay? So now what we're gonna do is to see the way that these four movements that I just described, of external rotation from the hips, of internal rotation further down into the legs, and of heels pressing into the floor, and of knees lifting toward the pelvis. We're going to see what happens when we bring all four of those movements into balance. So Sam's going to start by externally rotating from very deep in the hip sockets as if to pull his feet apart. So you can pull your feet apart just for a second so everyone can see. And so he's engaging from way deep in the hip sockets in order to make this movement. But now he's going to counteract this very aponic movement with a pranic gesture of pushing forward through the roots of the big toes, as if he were going to internally rotate the legs. So now you can push forward from here, from the roots of the big toes. He's going to push forward so that those two spirals come back into balance. So now what Sam might be feeling here is almost a sense of the legs being wrung out like this, sort of an external spiral from the upper half of the leg, an internal spiral in the lower half of the leg. And, you know, of course, they're not as distinct as all that, but there's this feeling of these two spirals coming together in each of the legs, okay? Now he's going to press the heels gently down into the floor, which is a more aponic action that engages the backs of the legs. And then he's also going to engage the fronts of the legs to pull the knees up toward the pelvis. And as he does that, what immediately happens, which is quite interesting, is that he has a narrowing and a hollowing out in front of the pelvis, almost like a scooping sensation in the front of the sacrum. And the belly then naturally lifts up out of the pelvic basin, and then the heart lifts and spreads in response. Okay? And because Sam's got this just right, you can see all of that sense of lift right through the midline. So why don't you just relax it all again, okay? And then, so here's Sam just being relaxed, sitting there, and now he's going to take these 4 movements in sequence again, and he's just working with the legs and the pelvis, but watch what happens to the spine and to his posture in general as he takes all 4 of those movements. The hands are doing nothing. They're very light. He's not pressing with his hands in order to lift his rib cage up. His hands are just resting on the floor. And in fact, in order to encourage yourself not to use your hands, you might even come up onto your fingertips and take the hands ever so slightly back. That gives you a little bit more space under the arms too, so that there's a sense of the rib cage just floating in response to this very strong union of pranic and aponic forces that's being experienced in the center of the pelvis. So basically the Mula Uddiyana Bandha pattern is being created just by these, mostly by these 2 pairs of opposing gestures coming together in the legs and pelvis, and that creates this upward lifting and spreading and this sense of vibrance, okay? So one thing that can really turn off the flow of sensation that Sam's feeling right now in Dandasana would be if he were to engage his hip flexors, if he were to engage in front of the pelvis, for example, in order to pull his pelvis further into an anterior tilt. So, and this is, I say this because it's really easy to think that the most important thing to do in Dandasana is to get the pelvis in a perfectly upright position. But unless you're quite flexible, your pelvis is very likely to be in more of a posterior tilt, and that's completely fine. There's nothing wrong with having a more posterior tilt in the pelvis in Dandasana. You can still work with those pairs of opposites, those 2 pairs of opposites, in order to create the sense of that Mula Uddiyana Bandha pattern, that sense of the prana gathering at the center of the pelvis and lifting up vibrantly through the midline and all the way up toward the soft palate, or maybe even all the way through the crown of the head, okay? So what you don't want to do is try to correct the posterior tilt by squeezing the hip flexors, because if you do that, squeeze your hip flexors, but sit up straight and squeeze your hip flexors like you're just trying to, like you're kind of fixated on the external form. So press your hands into the floor and there, okay? Now to the untrained eye, that might look like a pretty nice Dandasana, but the quality of his breath is completely changed. His breath suddenly became shorter, it became more labored, it became kind of grainy. And the reason is that the more aponic lower half of the body is no longer integrated as well with the more pranic upper half. So there's less communication now between the pelvic floor and the heart. And that's precisely because the psoas lines, which are lines of sensation that run through the physical psoas but extend quite far beyond the physical psoas in both directions, is closed off. It's tense. And those are also coincident with what's called Ida and Pingala nadis, which are the main channels of respiration for the subtle breath. So when those are contracted and squeezed, there's a real interference with deep, rhythmic, balanced breathing. And of course, we want our alignment to serve deep, rhythmic, balanced breathing. So we're looking for alignment cues that help us to open up those channels so that the prana can flow more freely through them. So don't worry about the posterior tilt. Just take these 4 actions that I described, externally rotating from deep in the hips, reaching forward through the roots of the big toes. Do that until your feet come together. Yep. Pressing the heels down into the floor and pulling the knees back toward the pubic bone. Everything else pretty much takes care of itself. When you feel that radiance lifting and spreading from the plane of the heart, you might drop the chin and look down the line of the nose toward the heart, and you're in a beautiful Dandasana. Now turning to Paschimottanasana. To do Paschimottanasana, you keep all of the same engagements in the legs. And this is extremely important because it's easy to just sort of let go of the legs and reach forward into a slumping forward fold. And if you do that, you lose all of that sense of vibrance and radiance that you created by balancing prana and apana in Dandasana. So you start in Dandasana, you find these gestures, right? And especially, you might tune in now to the way that this external rotation in the hips, or this engagement of deep external hip rotators, which doesn't have to be particularly strong. It's not that you're gripping in the pelvis or anything. There's just a sort of subtle engagement. You're making as if to externally rotate your legs, and then balancing that, of course, with pressing forward just beneath the big toe. But that feeling in the hips creates a sense of feeding lines of sensation from the legs up into the pelvic floor. And this is very important for creating the Mula Uddiyana pattern through the center of the body, which is to say the pattern of sensation gathering into the center of the pelvis and then being drawn up through the hollow center. So he's going to keep all of those actions in the legs and in the pelvis as he reaches forward and catches the big toes. We'll do the A variation. So he catches the big toes with first 2 fingers and thumb. And then he's going to take a deep breath in and open the prana pattern as much as possible. So he's going to lift the chin, look up at about 45 degrees, roll the collarbones back, lift the heart. He feels the heart lifting and spreading, but he's keeping the sitting bones dropped so that there's a nice balance between the aponic and the pranic energies. And then he stays with that feeling of openness and receptivity as he takes the next exhale and follows it down into the forward fold. Okay. And now as far as the head position goes, you could drop the head all the way down like this, or you could keep the head up a little bit, gazing toward the big toes. The conventional drishti, or gazing point, is toward the toes. If you find that if you're going quite deep and you're trying to actually see the big toes, you could be putting unnecessary strain on the neck that's not really conducive for a more sort of fluid experience of the form. So in that case, you might drop the head down, as Sam has done, because he's quite flexible, so he's pretty deep into this. And then he continues to reach the crown of the head forward toward the toes. And he's also using his arms to draw himself forward. So he's pulling himself forward, and even the lats are engaged. So he's pulling back, pulling on his toes like this. The elbows are out a little bit so that he has some protraction in the shoulder blades, some space between the shoulder blades, and he's not tense at the base of the neck. But he's pulling forward, particularly on the exhale. And then as he inhales, he finds a little more length each time. So inhale, he lifts a little. Exhale, he pulls forward and descends. Inhale, he lifts. Exhale, he pulls forward and descends. So you take 5 breaths or so here, and then on the 5th breath, you can straighten the arms and look up again at about 45 degrees, roll the collarbones back, feel the radiance spreading from the heart, and then exhale, release. Beautiful. So let's suppose now that you can't fold as deeply as Sam did, what to do? Well, one thing you might do is not worry about catching the big toes, right? And if you're quite stiff, you might sort of be pitched back like this too. And if you are pitched back like this, it could be helpful to sit up on a bolster or a cushion of some kind, because if you have something to sit up on, but just notice that if he's sitting up on something, then that's going to help him to get the pelvis in a position where he doesn't feel like he's falling back and slumping. So now he can take the hands down to the sides on the mat, and he'll inhale and he'll roll the collarbones back and lift the heart and get super long again. And then exhale, he'll walk the hands forward just a little. Remember, you're stiff here. No, be stiff, but do it with good form. Good. There you go. So he keeps the heart lifted, and on the inhale, he accentuates that lifting, spreading action, and on the exhale, he walks the hands forward a little bit and goes down. And so this is beautiful. So he's working with that balance of openness that's associated with the inhale pattern, and of stability and contraction that's associated with the exhale pattern, and feeling the way that those two energies interact, even in this form, which is more expressive of the exhale pattern. And he's doing it quite nicely. Okay? So now inhale, look up, and exhale, release, and I'm going to release you. Okay. Thank you, Sam. So I hope that these reflections on Dandasana and Paschimottanasana are helpful to you. Thank you for watching.